Hello and welcome to the race data analysis for the Qatar Grand Prix. This is the series in which we'll be compiling all of the lap times from this weekend's Grand Prix and pitting each of the teammates against one another to see exactly how well they've done against each other. In addition to just sort of giving a general race overview in the first sort of 7 to 10 minutes. Everything is all timestamped in the description down below, so please feel free to skip to whichever segment of the video you would like me to talk about. But without further ado, we will jump straight on into the race data overview and take a look at the positions table, which generally, for the top 3, was fairly boring. However, for the rest of the field, it was actually a rather interesting Grand Prix. We can see a couple of the early pit stops before lap 20, then there is that main bulk between 22 and 28, and then there are just a couple after that. So we've got Pierre Gasly on lap 34, Sergio Perez on lap 40, and then the puncture for Lando Norris at lap 48. But moving from the positions table, we can take a look at the overall lap time chart, which looks a little something like this, where we can clearly see the VSC period right at the very end of the race. And we can again clearly visualise where each of the pit stop groups originated. However, zooming in on the section of racing that we're most interested in, so excluding all of the pit stops, we can see a mammoth pace difference between Lewis Hamilton in the blue and Max Verstappen in the grey to the whole rest of the field. Usually when I take a look at these lap charts, we expect to see sort of 3 at minimum usually, bands of individual racing. We have the front runners, which usually consist of the 2 Mercedes and 2 Red Bulls. Then we have the midfield, which is usually the Ferraris, Alfa Tauris and McLarens. And then we have the rear end of the field, which is everybody else. Very occasionally this will split into 4, and very, very rarely has it split into 5 clear, distinct pace bands. And these pace bands are very, very distinct in the opening stint of the race, when everyone is super heavy on fuel. That is when the front runners pull away massively, and then everything sort of all peters back together at the end of the race. However, what we can see here is that Verstappen and Hamilton were massively quicker, around a second per lap, at times 2 seconds per lap faster than the rest of the field. So this advantage maintains itself into the second stint of the race, with again Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton out front. However, it is Bottas and Perez who actually make up this middle group, with everybody else in the backpack as well. So Hamilton and Verstappen's advantage is now around half a second at points, sometimes a second per lap, over Bottas and Perez, who themselves have around half a second to the rest of the field. And we can see at the end of the race that it splits into roughly 2 individual pace groups, where it is Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton again, but equally they are joined by Sergio Perez, who is setting as competitive lap times as they are. And once again, they're about half a second to a second quicker per lap than everybody else. But what we can do from this is we can take a look at the gap to the race leader, and we can really see how much of an advantage they had over everybody else. So we can see Hamilton is the straight, consistent blue line at the bottom as he led from lights to flag, with Max Verstappen being the grey line just above. And we can see that at no points he was really losing drastically any time. The gap stayed at around 8 to 10 seconds for the entire race. However, the pace drop-off to everybody else is the biggest that we have seen so far this year, with that green line all the way at the top being once again Nikita Mazepin having a race to forget. But what we can do with all of these drivers' lap times is we can isolate all of their clean air laps to determine exactly how quick each car was going when they weren't stuck in traffic. And in order to do this, there is a big algorithm that I have created which locates all of the laps that were set outside of a particular time window. And for Qatar, this was set at 3 seconds. So any lap time that you set outside of 3 seconds of the car in front will be counted into this average. However, there is a small truncation period that happens from these resulted laps. We remove the fastest 2, and then we also remove the slowest 30%. Then of that truncated section, those get averaged, and we end up with a leaderboard that looks a little like this. It was actually Max Verstappen who had the fastest average lap by just 1.5 tenths to Lewis Hamilton, and they actually had very comparative clean air laps, 39 for Lewis and 38 for Verstappen, with Sergio Perez interestingly being the next closest to them, 3 tenths behind Verstappen, and then there was a mammoth 1 second gap to Sebastian Vettel. This was one of the first times that Aston Martin have really shown a solid, strong performance. We also have the gap expressed as a percentage. This is in order for me to compare it to all of the previous races that we have held so far this year. There is the number of clean air laps that each driver had, so we can see that Lance Stroll, all the way at the bottom, even though he finished in P6, only had 3 clean air laps, which were extremely slow. So as this is an outlier race for Lance Stroll, he will not be averaged in any of the calculations going forward for the Qatar Grand Prix. This is then expressed as a percentage of clean air laps over the whole race distance, and then also the standard deviation of those clean air laps across their entire race. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take that middle percentage gap column and we're going to average it across all of the races that have happened so far this year, obviously excluding all of the rainy races. Then from that we will just subtract the percentage of the fastest driver, the driver that is at the top, so they are set at a benchmark of 0 and everybody else is behind. And by doing that we can see that Max Verstappen is still the fastest driver so far this year in clean air by just 0.08% to Lewis Hamilton, where 0.08% is roughly 0.08 of a second at long tracks that are around 100 seconds like Spa. Perez is then comfortably the third fastest driver with Valtteri Bottas in P4. Then doing exactly the same for the teams, we can again see that Red Bull and Mercedes are massively clear of everybody else, but they are so close. Bear in mind, this is a percent of every single racing lap. They are just 0.06 at long tracks apart from each other per racing lap. Ferrari moves slightly further ahead of McLaren, who have had a little bit of a dip in performance this year. And then just to visualize exactly where each of these drivers' clean air laps pop up, we have this graph here, and we can see that Lewis Hamilton at the bottom and Max Verstappen being the third line up from the bottom, they have extremely comparative sets of clean air laps. Again, 39 for Hamilton and 38 for Verstappen. However, to offset the fact that clean air laps set in the first 50% of the race will be slower than those set in the last 50% of the race due to fuel loads, I have done this whole clean air lap analysis on the stints of each driver. So for stint number 1, we have the soft compound of tyre runners on the left and the medium compound of tyre runners on the right. And we can see that for the medium tyres in stint number 1, Hamilton was 0.4 a lap faster than Max Verstappen and 0.2 faster than Valtteri Bottas. Then the drivers who have a bracketed asterisk by their name are drivers who did run this compound of tyre in this stint, however they never set any clean air laps. They were always within 3 seconds of the car in front. Equally, I have stumbled into a small little coding issue with the standard deviation on this column, so please ignore the standard deviation on these stint graphs. Then doing exactly the same for stints number 2, where most of the drivers were on the hard compound of tyres, it was once again Hamilton who was the fastest, but only just by 0.09 of a second to Max Verstappen, with both drivers setting 22 clean air laps in stint number 2. With Vettel being the fastest car by some margin on the medium tyres and actually slotting into P3 for the fastest clean air stint in stint number 2. Now there were just a couple of drivers who set a stint number 3. Now also please note that Nikita Mazepin did do a stint 3 on the softs, however he was the only driver to do so, so it isn't relevant to put his time on the board. And in stint number 3, this was where Verstappen was a little bit quicker by 2.5 to Lewis Hamilton. So with the race overview all done and dusted, what we're going to do now is we're going to break down each of the teammates' performances. We are going in 2020 Constructors' Championship order, so we'll start with Mercedes and end with Williams. I'll be explaining each of the graphs detailed in this section in the Mercedes panel, so if you want to stick around for that explanation, let's go through that now. So on screen now is the Mercedes panel. We start in the top left, which shows their lap time chart. Lewis Hamilton is in the black line and Valtteri Bottas is in the turquoise. Now usually there would be a grey dotted line on this chart which would denote the fastest car at the previous event. However, there was no previous Qatar event, so that is no longer present. Directly below that we have the Mercedes gaps chart, which denotes the gap between the two drivers on every single lap of the race. We then have their positions chart in the top right, and then directly below that we have their percentage pace difference. Now this percentage pace difference takes all of Lewis Hamilton's lap times, will divide them all by Valtteri Bottas's lap times, and convert them into a percentage. Any percentage that is above 100 is where Lewis Hamilton is going faster, and then any percentage below 100 is where Valtteri Bottas is going faster. These percentages then get ordered from largest down to smallest, and we end up with a distribution that looks a little something like this. And we can actually split this distribution down the middle, and we can see that for just 8.3% of the laps raced, it is Valtteri Bottas who is the faster Mercedes, and therefore for 91.7% of the laps raced, it was Lewis Hamilton. And this is by far and away the largest Mercedes pace gap that we've seen all season. With interestingly the larger gaps actually coming in the latter half of the season. They are becoming more spread towards Lewis Hamilton in the second half. But turning our attention to the gaps chart, we can see a ridiculous 2-second advantage, at times 3-second advantage between the two drivers, with Lewis Hamilton setting lap times in the low 1 minute 28s and Valtteri Bottas being in the 1 minute 31s. This extends the gap all the way to 40 seconds by lap 14 as Valtteri Bottas is struggling to get through the traffic. Hamilton then comes in for his pit stop, which dips the gap down to 20 seconds, and there is still a mammoth pace gap of around a second per lap until Valtteri Bottas has his puncture, and then he drops all the way down to P14, has his pit stop at the same time as well, and then ends up unfortunately retiring. But had Mercedes actually pulled Valtteri Bottas in just that little bit earlier, it would have been a much better race for Valtteri Bottas. But taking a look now at the Mercedes pace, and unfortunately we can't compare it to the previous event as there was no previous event, but the clean air lap pace between the two drivers, there was a second difference between the two. And in stint number 1, this was a 0.2 difference on the medium compound of tyre to Lewis Hamilton, and stint number 2, it was 7.5 to Lewis Hamilton. Now equally, I won't be comparing stint number 3 as Valtteri Bottas didn't complete one even though Hamilton did. Then from Mercedes we can take a look at Red Bull, and again we start by splitting that percentage pace difference down the middle, and we can see that for 19.3% it was Sergio Perez in the dark blue line who was the faster Red Bull, and therefore for 80.7% it was Max Verstappen. And much like the Mercedes panel, we can see a second per lap difference between the two drivers in that opening stint, with Verstappen being extremely consistent. He was setting very consistent lap times in that opening stint. Both drivers come in for pit stops fairly early on and very close together as well, where again Verstappen is extremely consistent, unlike Sergio Perez who has a couple of slow laps and a couple of fast laps. Interestingly, both drivers come in on the same lap at lap number 41, so there is absolutely no effect on their gaps chart whatsoever. However, in the final stint, Perez actually manages to match Verstappen perfectly for lap times in the 1 minute 26s, which nicely plateaus the gap at just below 1 minute between the two drivers, where one ended up finishing P2 and the other ended up finishing P4. But again, taking a look at the Red Bull clean air lap pace between the two drivers, there was just 3.5 between them across the whole race, where stint number 1 on the mediums, Perez never set any clean air laps, and stint number 2, there was a 6.5 difference when they moved on to the hards. And then on stint number 3, where they both went back to the mediums, it was 3.5, again, all in Verstappen's favour. So from Red Bull, we'll now take a look at McLaren, and splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 23.2% it was Daniel Ricciardo in the blue, who was the faster of the pair, and therefore for 76.8% it was Lando Norris. Now this was honestly a race to forget for McLaren, however in that opening stint of the race they were literally even. The gap was hovering at 10 seconds, even with a whopping great big positional difference between the two drivers. They both come in for pit stops at a very similar time, however Ricciardo does briefly overtake Lando Norris, but only very briefly. Then post this pit stop, a large gulf actually opens up between them, where Norris is able to extend a gap all the way up to 40 seconds and at times 50 seconds before his tyre failure at lap 48. And McLaren really have struggled, only scoring 4 points in the last 3 races at this triple header. But without Lando Norris's puncture, he would have actually finished quite comfortably in the top 5. However, it was Ricciardo who was the one that really struggled in this race. And we can see that by comparing their clean air lap pace, there was a 6.5 difference between the two drivers across the whole race distance. Where stint number 1, where Norris was on the softs and Ricciardo on the mediums, it was just over 4 tenths, and stint number 2, this is stretched to 7 tenths in Norris's favour. But then from McLaren, we'll take a look at Aston Martin, and splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 44.6% of the race, it was Lance Stroll in the pink, who was the faster of the two cars, and therefore for 55.4%, it was Sebastian Vettel. Now this was a much better race for Aston Martin at the Qatar circuit. If Sebastian Vettel hadn't have got that poor start at the very beginning of the race, you know that he would have been in their points much further than P10. But taking a look at their lap time chart, there is a small little disparity with Lance Stroll actually pumping in consistent lap times over Sebastian Vettel, at times a second a lap quicker, where he's able to extend this gap almost to 15 seconds at the first pit stop phase. Where Stroll comes in first, where Sebastian Vettel is able to briefly overtake until he comes in for his pit stop, and then post driver's pit stop, they're literally setting identical lap times once again. This gap comes down from about 20 seconds at its peak, all the way back down to nearly 10. And taking a look at Aston Martin's performance across this whole race, Stroll actually didn't set enough clean air laps to make a comparable average. It was in the 1:40s overall. Which means there isn't really any point in comparing their stints, as there is nothing to compare Sebastian Vettel to. So from Aston Martin, we'll take a look at Alpine, and splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 26.3% it was Esteban Ocon in the white, who was the faster of the pair, and therefore for 73.7% it was Fernando Alonso in the blue. And much like Aston Martin, this was a mega weekend for Alpine, bagging the second highest constructors' points of the weekend with a P3 and a P5. And in that opening stint, much like the Aston Martins, they were fairly even. However, the gap did extend in Alonso's favour to 10 seconds just before the pit stop phase, where Alonso came in first and then Ocon came in just afterwards, and we see a small little spike in Fernando Alonso's lap time as he is actually trying to get past Valtteri Bottas when he had his puncture and he had to make avoiding action to go through the sparks. However, post these drivers' pit stops, the gap slowly increases in Alonso's favour from just over 10 seconds to around 20 by the checkered flag. So taking a look at Alpine's performance across this entire race, there was just 1.5 tenth difference between the two drivers. Where across stint number 1, it was actually 7 tenths on the soft compound of tyre in Alonso's favour, and stint number 2, this came down to 1.5 tenths in Alonso's favour on the hards. Then from Alpine, we can take a look at Ferrari, and splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 49.1% it was Carlos Sainz in the black line who was faster, and therefore for 50.9% it was Charles Leclerc in the red. But taking a look at Ferrari's lap time chart, we can see, if not for a couple of laps where Leclerc was around half a second a lap quicker, they're very, very even. Both drivers again come in for a pit stop where Ferrari actually perform a successful double stack pit stop, and then post pit stop, again in the final stint, they are literally dead even. Both drivers, much like Brazil, exceptionally even. And this is exactly what you want. You want the team gelling in this exact way so they can compete with McLaren to secure that P3 in the Constructors' Championship. But taking a look at Ferrari's pace overall, between the two drivers there was a 4/10 difference in Sainz's favour. So much like Brazil, however this time Sainz was ahead, unlike in Brazil where he was behind. Across stint number 1, where they were both on the mediums, Sainz never actually set any clean air laps, and stint number 2 on the hards, there was a 2/10 difference in Sainz's favour. So from Ferrari, we will now take a look at Alfa Tauri, and splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 28.6% it is Yuki Tsunoda in the white who is the faster car, and therefore for 71.4% it is Pierre Gasly in the black. Now even though they're fairly close in pace, there is actually a large disparity between the two drivers of around 3 to 4 tenths per lap consistently across this entire race in Gasly's favour. But both drivers came in for ridiculously early pit stops, which put them on that 2-stop strategy, and in that middle stint, again Gasly is around 3 to 4 tenths a lap quicker than Yuki Tsunoda, where he extends the gap over him to around 15 seconds. They then come in for their second stops, which really do end up ruining their race as they're not able to fight back into the points, and then in that third stint, again Pierre Gasly is around 3 to 4 tenths a lap quicker than Tsunoda. And absolutely a race to forget for AlphaTauri, having one car start in P2 and the other inside the top 10, and then to have both cars finish outside of the points, and well outside of the points, is just not how you want it to go. But taking a look at the two drivers' performance overall, there was a 3.5 difference between them across the entire race distance in clean air in Gasly's favour. In stint number 1, neither driver set a clean air lap on the softs. Stint number 2, there was a 6.5 difference on the mediums, and stint 3, there was a 5 difference with Tsunoda on the hards and Gasly on the mediums. So from Alfa Tauri, we will now take a look at Alfa Romeo, and splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 42.9% it was Giovinazzi in the white, who was the faster of the two cars, and therefore for 57.1% it was Raikkonen in the red. And much like the past couple of teams excluding Alfa Tauri, they are pretty much identical in the opening stint of the race. The gap stays at around 3 seconds up until an extremely early pit stop for Raikkonen, and then a couple of laps later the pit stop for Giovinazzi, where he loses out by a couple of seconds, as the gap before the pit stops was 2 seconds in Raikkonen's favour, and then after Giovinazzi's stop the gap was around 5. Then after their second round of pit stops in the middle portion of the race, they actually set fairly equal lap times, right up until lap 44, where Raikkonen actually puts his foot to the floor and accelerates a gap of a second per lap to Antonio Giovinazzi, which extends the gap all the way to 15 seconds from 5 in just 10 laps. And comparing the two Alfa Romeos together across this entire race distance, there was a 1.5 second pace difference between the two of them in clean air. Where in stint number 1, Raikkonen never set any clean air laps on his soft compound of tyres, and in stint number 2, there was an 0.08 of a second difference between them in Giovinazzi's favour. However, it wasn't until stint number 3 where Raikkonen extended this advantage to a second per lap on the hard compound of tyre compared to Giovinazzi on the mediums. Then penultimately, we'll take a look at Haas, and we can split their percentage pace difference down the middle, and we can see that for 30.9% of the race, it was Nikita Mazepin in the white, who was the faster of the two cars, and therefore for 69.1%, it was Mick Schumacher in the grey. Now really bizarrely, in the first portion of the race, they were literally dead even, exactly like Alfa Romeo. The gap was staying at around 3 to 4 seconds, right up until Schumacher came in for his pit stop, where Mazepin briefly took over, and then it sort of went to pot. I'm not entirely sure what happened to Nikita Mazepin, but he lost so much time. He came in for a pit stop at around lap 32, but his lap times are ridiculously inconsistent. This is absolutely ridiculous. Seeing Mick Schumacher being consistently in the 1-minute 29s, and then Mazepin fluctuating between 1-minute 35s and 1-minute 29s seemingly every other lap, is bonkers. Yes, you could argue that it's awkwardness with blue flags, but then you can't really see that too much with Mick Schumacher's performance, and this was enough to extend the gap from 40 seconds just after Mazepin's pit stop, all the way up to 80 seconds at the checkered flag, which is just not acceptable performance levels. Which means when we compare the two drivers' clean air lap pace across the entire race distance, there is a 0.6 difference per lap between the two drivers, mainly because of how close they were in that opening stint. Where in stint number 1, Mazepin never set any clean air laps on his softs, and in stint number 2, there was a difference of 0.4 between the two drivers. And then finally we'll take a look at Williams, and splitting their percentage pace difference down the middle, we can see that for 46% exactly it was Nicholas Latifi in the blue who was the faster of the two cars, and therefore for 54% it was George Russell in the white. And this is a very, very even trend that we have seen so far this season. Sometimes it's 55-45 in Latifi's favour, and sometimes it is 54-46 in Russell's favour. And we can see very clearly looking at the lap time chart and the gaps chart directly below it that they were just dead even. They were pretty much following each other this entire race distance. The gap stayed at around 3 seconds for stint number 1, and then after their first round of pit stops, the gap was staying at around 5 seconds. Some little fluctuations with blue flags for both drivers. They weren't particularly consistent in this second stint. And unfortunately, right at the very end, both drivers had their punctures, which unfortunately led to the retirement of Nicholas Latifi. But comparing the two Williams clean air lap pace across this entire race distance, there was a 0.3 difference in Russell's favour to Nicholas Latifi. Where in stint number 1, neither driver set any clean air laps on their soft compound of tyres, and in stint number 2, there was just a 1 thousandth of a second difference in Russell's favour on the hard compound tyre. And there we go, there is the data analysis for the Qatar Grand Prix all done and dusted. What was the most interesting thing you found about the data presented in today's video? Please let me know in the comments down below. But that is all I've got for you today, guys. I hope you have enjoyed, and I will catch you in the next video with whatever and whenever I decide to make it. I'll see you guys then.